Hello, everyone, or anyone who's turned up today. I know it's been a bit of a crazy day with Alpine Day, with Sparcy's event sourcing package, course and books. Sorry, there's been a lot going on today, along with the usual workload, and now streaming. So I hope everyone's doing well. I am about to get started, I think. So today I am working on Castor again. What I'm thinking is this episode I'm going to cover some API stuff because I've been asked to by a couple of people. Probably a short and sweet one this time round. Nice, easy REST API. Just go through the workflow, go through how I work with building APIs in Laravel. And then next stream, I might go back to PHP Online because I'd like to get some of that finished so I can start getting that up for people to use. And I also want to build a analytics engine for it using event sourcing, which will be another fun adventure. So for now, I will just start, I suppose. So the first thing, if you want to have a look at the code base at all, as usual, I will pop it in the comments. And that is now on your screen. So if you have a look at that, it is github.com/juststeveking/Castor, CASTR. Feel free to have a look. Here is the front end for it so far. It doesn't really do much. It's not customized in any way yet. We've only got minimal stuff going on. But we have something. We have a basic front end for us to start using. We're not going to be looking at this much today because we're building an API. We are going to use Postman. So usually what I would do is go through let's design my API and let's create an open API specification and go through it that way. And I do have the start of one here. But that would be a really boring stream for you to watch. So I'm probably going to do that in the background at some point. And I'm just going to hack on an API. So there's nothing really I need to add in this right now. The only things we've got so far in our application is I've switched to a light theme to see if it's a little bit easier on your eyes. So please let me know if there's any issues. All we've got really so far is lots of back-end processes going on, and all of that is within this source directory here, mostly in our catalog and very little within shared because that's just our user model. So what we're going to do, we're going to look at an API. And the first thing I do when I'm building an API is come straight over to my root service provider and I start to modify this. So the first thing we need to look at is we just need to uncomment that in a moment. Home is dashboard. That's cool. We can leave that there. So the first step is we want that prefix for API because we are building an API. But first, what we want to do is we want to create a group. Sorry, hiccups. And we want the middleware. We want the API middleware. We also want to add the prefix of API. We will give that an initial name of API. And then we will start grouping. So within here, what we're going to do is we're going to grab this and we're just going to move that up because we want to move it up a block. And this won't need that prefix API, but we're going to have a prefix of v1. Don't need the middleware. We don't want the namespace. And the base path is going to be /API/v1. This is a REST API, and it will be versioned. And all we're doing is wrapping it all into some nice middleware. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to swap the prefix and the middleware around, so it's a little bit more obvious when you first look at it. So we're prefixing with API v1 for anything within that file. All of those routes are going to be wrapped in an API middleware. Going to begin the name with API : so that eventually we will have things like as a root name, which is nice and clean. And then what else are we going to want in here? So there's our group. And what this allows us to do is start developing v2 down there, and it will just work nicely. We can start adding it, and then as we start adding version 2 routes, we can start removing them or adding redirects in the v1 so that we can just migrate people across slowly. Nice and clean, nice and easy. So there's that. That's our root service provider. That's the initial step. The next step is to come into routes. Hi, Bernard. Thanks for coming, buddy. We'll create an API folder within there. I'm good. I've had a pretty productive day doing lots of, what have I been doing today? Inertia and Vue.js stuff. Creating lots of reusable components for platform at work. So it's been kind of fun. I don't want that yet, do I? Well, we'll leave it in there. I don't think I'm going to want that. So that's where our routes will live. We've lined it up all within the controller. So what we will quickly do is, let's do a PHP artisan root list. And we will just drop that action so it fits on the page nicer. So what we've got is API v1 user as is defined in this file here. That is the first one we've got. It begins with API. That will most likely be deleted. And what we want to do, we need to figure out what we want from this API. So APIs, they kind of need to have a purpose, right? You can't just blindly create that. We did that last time. But you can't just blindly create a API because then you're just creating a CRUD wrapper for JSON. So what we're going to do is what is the purpose of the API? And the way I'm imagining it is we're going to eventually have something like a mobile application, perhaps, that will connect to Caster, and people will be able to, see what podcasts they've subscribed to, listen to new episodes, get notified on new episodes, get notified on announcements from podcast authors, and kind of interact basically. So what I'll do, I'll start with a basic API design here. So we're going to want to be able to do things like we want to get podcasts. We want to see what podcasts there are. We're going to want to get podcasts. We want to get a specific podcast. We're also going to want to do something like get my subscriptions, get my following. They're not strictly, hey, buddy, nice to see you. Thanks for coming. I see that you've left the dark side. Yeah, I thought I'd try light mode on here just to see if it kind of makes it any better, because I know dark mode can be quite hard for some people to see. So I'm going to give this a go and see how we get on. We're probably going to relook at these. So we might look at another way to do those. So we might just have something like user subscriptions, where we get the logged in user and user following. Maybe we'll see. Those two could potentially change. But what we also want to be able to do is we want to maybe we want people to be able to update their create their podcast or link it through the mobile app, because that would be useful. They're going to want to update the podcast. They could potentially want to delete their podcast, which we hope they don't. And then from a subscriptions perspective, do we want to do a post user subscriptions? Probably not. What we're most likely going to want to do is kind of block this in here, because the main resource on this is the podcast. It's not about the user, it's about the podcast. Did anyone get a copy, Isaac? Yes, I happened to get a copy. Downloads. I got my copy. I was lucky enough to get early access thanks to Freak, who was very, very generous in giving me an early access link, which was really good. And I've almost finished reading it, and I've almost finished watching the video course. It's been quite interesting. So let's say if I'm the podcast author, I want to be able to say, I want to get all of my subscribers. I also want to be able to get all of my followers. But at the same time, I might want to, no, it wasn't a free copy. I did pay for it. Freak just gave me an early access link so that I could download it and pay for it early. Because I've been rambling on about it, and I've been pestering both him and Brent about the course for longer than they could handle, I think. Okay, so this part, this is also perhaps could change. But that's the thing with API design, is if you just jump into it, you start naming things wrong and things just don't make sense, because what you're really doing here is you're getting the audience. And you might want to do something like, when I want my audience, I want all of them, or I might just want to filter out for subscribers, or I might want to filter out for followers. That could change. So the naming conventions could change on this part. Subscribe to podcast API. Subscribe, unsubscribe. That is what I'm getting onto next. So this is where I would probably do something like a post to the podcasts, and I would probably do something like audience. And within there, I would pass in a payload where it would be like, what type am I? I am a follower or a subscriber, because there's very little difference. It's just a different type of how you're subscribing. So we'll look at that part, but we'll get to that when we actually get through some of these other endpoints, I think. And obviously, we're also going to want to do a search endpoint, because, what's the point in trying to find podcasts if you can't search? That's the one thing that really bugs me about the Google Stadia app, is that you can't actually search for games. Quite frustrating. So let me just providers. So we're adding the root service provider, and we will add in the roots API and the roots API v1, and we'll just commit that as organizing API roots. We'll just commit this, just so in case you want to follow along at home. Ooh. So that is that initial part done. So we will now start building. So the first thing we want to look at is, let's just delete that and that and as always, declare some strict types. This actually caught me out earlier today. Strict types, because I was passing something in that wasn't strictly the object I was meant to. We're creating two APIs for subscribe or a single API. I'm more likely to create two endpoints. One is going to be to create a subscription, and one will be to delete a subscription, because you want it to kind of follow the verb. You are unsubscribing, but you're actually just deleting that subscription. So you just perform a delete request, a little bit more in following of HTTP and REST. So first step, we're going to have a new route here, and this is going to be for getting podcasts. So we will prefix this with podcasts. We will give this a name of podcasts, and then we will start our group. There isn't any additional middleware at this point that we need. Strict types. So strict types. What strict types does is it enforces the strictest possible typing system within PHP. So by adding scalar type hints and enabling strict requirements, it is hoped that more correct and self-documented PHP programs can be written. So the idea is it's enforcing you to pass in exactly what you're meant to be passing in, and not just pass in a potential match. So what I like to do is I like to group these. So podcast routes, and then we start off with list podcasts. So we are going to have a get request, which is going to have a name of index, because we follow a convention. This could be list, but I prefer index because it works for me. And this is just going to be on that first forward slash. And then the action itself will be something like an index controller, because it will be invocable. So what I need to do is I need to create that. So I'll comment it out, come back to my terminal, and we'll PHP artisan make a controller, and we are going to make it in the API namespace under v1, and we are going to create podcasts index controller, and this will be invocable. This is how I like to make my controllers, specifically API ones. Then I expand this, it's got that full namespace, and then I bring all of this down so it is easily legible. And there we go. We've got it. It is, we just by looking at this, we know that this is a list podcasts, and there's a controller, and we can click through to go straight to it. And let's quickly sort those imports. I have organized all of the stubs. I have gone through some stubs, and I have worked on the controller invocable. So it looks like the controller is, yeah, I should be fine. No, thank you. So what we're going to want to do here is, at this point, we don't really need that request. That can go. We're not needing the request at this specific stage. So first off is we'll start with a very basic implementation where we just go return podcast all. Very simple, very straightforward. We'll drop that for now, and we will come back to how we're going to work on that in a moment. So we've got a route. We've got a controller that is returning something. Let's add it to our Postman collection. So let's, not an API collection. We want to add a folder within here, and we're going to call this one podcasts. And within there, we will add a request and we call this one get all podcasts. And we are using our environment variable for URL. So within here, I can just do that API v1 podcasts. Now, if I just send this straight away, it gives me exactly what I'm expecting. I've only got one stored currently. Shame I can't like collapse this side panel a bit more. Can I? Yes, I can. Oh my God, that's beautiful. So we can see that we've got PHP ugly in here. It's got a UUID, it's got a title, where it was generated, it's got all the information we could possibly want. So now, the main problem that I like to be specific in case I start to add more than one. So typically, let's rename this. I thought I did rename this. List all podcasts. Just drop that for now and close that panel back down. So what we've got is list all podcasts. And what we'll probably do is call that, not V1, sorry. So if we add a V2, we can add it under the same one and we've got full control here. If you're not doing any sort of URL versioning, then yeah, drop it all within that environment. Okay, so 7 hidden. So it's giving us accept anything basically, and we don't want that. What we want is hide the auto-generated ones. We want to accept application JSON .api application/vnd.api.json. So what that is the JSON API specification header, that media type that you are meant to work with, because you are working with an API and that would potentially get swapped. So if you look at GitHub's, you'll see that says GitHub. So we could, in theory, swap that to caster.api.json, and that would be absolutely fine. It doesn't change much because that and that are the most important things. These are more the kind of vendor prefix and that sort of thing. And we want to accept So I'll just keep it as that. So what we're doing is we're accepting this. All we want is a nice, give me all of them. Hey, Benjamin. Yeah, I'm doing really good. Thank you. Really, really good. Doing APIs. I love APIs. So what we do next is organize our windows. And that doesn't sit well with me. That isn't what we want. You know, we don't want to just go, okay, so here they are from the database exactly as you want them, as they are stored, all of that magic. We want to, you know, the next step would be, okay, so we want to return a, I could use a response helper, but I'm just going to return a new response. And we are going to use a Illuminate HTTP response where the content is that, and the status is something else. So you can just do a 200 and say, yeah, all okay. So if I come back, send that again, exactly the same, no difference whatsoever. Still 200, okay. Yeah, I've been using JavaScript for so long, but I like it but hate it all at the same time. And so there we go. Next step. This is great, but let's say you've got another developer on your team who might not be as up to date with status codes as you are. And it's like, okay, so why is it returning a 200? What does that even mean? This is where you can start to look at, okay, so we will use the Symfony component response, and we'll say HTTP OK. Great, but now we're having to pull in this massive library here, which has got all of these responses in there, which is fine, but it's also managing all of these status codes, constructing, creating a new response. It's too much for what we actually need it to be. So that's not quite what we're after. However, Steve to the rescue, we can do a composer require just Steve King, HTTP status code, and I can just pull that in. Done. That allows me to just go HTTP, make sure I import that, and I am using status code HTTP, and we're just saying, okay. Now this class, compared to the Symfony one, is a lot more simple. All it does is it's got a hell of a lot of public constants that will just let you choose which one you need. It's got all of the ones directly from Wikipedia, all mapped exactly. I think I even left in teapot. Yep, I am a teapot. I left that in because I love that status code. So that is how I do it. HTTP, okay. It's not a HTTP facade. It is a nice simple package I made, which just returns constants because it's nice and easy. So there's that. Let's run that again. Send. Excellent. We're still getting the 200 okay. So let's change this. Let's say we just want accepted. 202 accepted. Perfect. And what happens if we wanted a different status code? I'm a teapot. 418. I'm a teapot. Perfect. But we don't want to play around too much. We want HTTP okay. Yeah, we got this content. Here you go. That's one step, but the data is still all a little bit messy, right? So next step is, let's just reset that for us. And what we want is a artisan make a, it's not a request, it is a resource. And we'll stick that in API. Actually, we don't need to stick it in API. We can stick it in a V1, just in case they change as time goes on. And we will just call this a podcast resource. Done. Close that down. And now, if we come down here, we can go to resources v1 podcast resource. Perfect. Script types is already on there. Casting to an array is already on there. Everything is all set up just the way I like it. So if you keep it as this, it's not much different to using this. So what we can do is we can say podcast resource. We want a collection and we want all of them. So now if we send that, it's no different. It's, you know, it's still just a little bit databasey. So we start to modify this. So the first step is to say, okay, so we don't just want to like cast it to an array. What we want to do is, okay, so we want the ID to be this ID that for the model. So when you're in the resource here, this relates to the model itself. We want the UUID, so we can say this UUID. What else have we got on that model that we could play with? We can have the, when we're listing, we want like the title, this title. Let's say author and image. So let's just go have a look at that, see how that comes back out. So there we go. We've got something really horrible going on there. So let's have a look at just JSON decoding that. There we go. So our image has got a link, a title, and URL. We've got an author, title, UUID and ID, and that's not a bad place to stop. You're controlling that response. You're not replicating the database design exactly. You're choosing the parts that you want to be able to show, and that's fine. You can just do that. However, you can take it a step further. What happens if you want to include relationships? What happens if you want to say, okay, so we want the author, and we could owner, the owner of the podcast, and we want that to be the owner. So if we hit that again, okay, now we've got a user, and yeah, that just looks ugly. Like, that's not what we want. So we need to work on this. And what happened, we might not want the owner all the time. So yeah, we can conditionally load it, but it's still just going to look a little bit messy. Hey, PHP Ugly is here. We are working with your podcast. We are working on an API around the data I have pulled back from your podcast. And what we will do, I don't know if there's been an episode since I last recorded. I believe there was. I can do an artisan cast async. Perfect. So now what we can also do is, let's just drop that, and let's also come back to our resource here. And let's say we also want the episodes. We just load the episodes in like that and send it again. And look, we get loads of episodes. I'm a PHP Uggo. Oh, you're recording tonight. Oh, I'll try not to do anything wrong on the on my stream that you're gonna affect. Oh, wait. Oh God, my wife's here now as well. Jeez, everybody's turning up. No pressure. No pressure. So back to what I was saying. I won't let it get to me. This is almost just a replication of a database again, and these are all just being dumped in. You know, there's no conditional loading to them. There's nothing controlled about how we're doing this. So what we're going to do instead is we are going to follow the JSON schema, JSON API schema. So we'll have an ID, and how do we want to reference them? You've been here since the start. Oh, thanks, wife. So has UUID. This has got a static UUID. That's for querying in the event sourcing aspect. What we'll also do in this, we will do a public function get root key name, which will return a string. And basically, anytime we get a podcast, we spell things wrong. We want to say, okay, route this to the UUID. Route this from the UUID, sorry. So when it comes to the resource itself, the ID, we kind of want to link that to what they're going to be referencing. It's not specifically the ID. It's the ID of the resource, not the ID of what's been stored in the database. So we can say this UUID. We can give it a type, and we can just say that this is a podcast. Then we can pass in the attributes. We will also pass in relationships. And eventually we'll also pass in links. So what we'll end up with eventually is something that looks a little bit more like this, but with more data. And it's just a lot nicer to look at and a lot more organized and a lot more structured. You can tell what's a relationship, what's an attribute, and you've got links available. So the first thing, we don't really need the ID. The ID is pointless to that end user. Everything is hooked through UUID. Eventually, we might want to add it, but right now, not that important. And we've already got that UUID. So we can add the title. Perfect, title, we got it. And then next, we can look at pulling in the copyright, because why not? What else could we possibly want at this stage? Maybe the image. You know, if we're listing things, we're probably going to want the image, right? So at this part, we can just do something like JSON decode this image because it's stored as a JSON string. And then when we come back, excellent. we've got a podcast with the attributes of title, copyright, and image. That's the main parts to it. We could probably add the description in there, but that's probably going to be quite large. We'll add it anyway. We'll put that above the image. Description, bang. There we go. So that is kind of like the minimum what I would want for this. Why did you add type? So it's all part of JSON API. The specification, which I like to follow. You can view the specification. It's quite a lot to go through. It'll be quite a lot to explain about how it works, why it does things certain ways. But it's a standard. Yeah, it's just a standard to follow. And I like to follow standards. It's why I like PSRs. So it's just one of those things, define a standard, stick with it and follow it. Like your naming conventions for your routes, how you're loading in routes, how you're organizing things in your code structure. Having those standards and following those standards means that if anybody else joins the team, they can start to understand the standards. And then, yeah, of course I can share that link. And once they understand the standards, you can quite simply, anybody new joining the team, they can quickly pick up on the standards. They're not going to put code in places that's not where people are used to seeing it. And it just makes it a lot easier for onboarding and going forward and doing anything. So relationships, we'll get onto this one. So owner, I don't think owner will be that important for this, but we'll add it. It's one of those kind of optional, do we really want it at this stage on a listing? So probably not. Episodes. So we'll go for episodes and we'll do a this when loaded. And we will do a relationship is episodes. Tell you what, we'll do it this way. And the value is going to be, now I believe something's changed, so this might not work as I expect it. So relationships episodes, well, it's already loaded, so great. For some reason, that shouldn't really be working. Let's go look at the docs because I'm sure something's changed since I last had to do this. Conditional relationships. Collection, this one loaded. Conditional pivots. Pivots, okay. That should be fine. That should be as I'm expecting it. Yeah, that's fine. This when loaded. And the value will be, that'll be wrapped within a resource eventually. So now we've got these. So we've got relationships, we've got episodes, we've got all that good stuff. So that next step is to create an episodes resource. So let's create an episode resource. Great. So now we can just grab all of that and say episode resource. It's going to be a collection. And let's just say resources this. So what we're doing here is episodes resource collection is going to be created and it will pass through when loaded, null or the episodes that we do have. I don't know why that is displaying because I'm not actually asking it to load. Something is going a little bit winky wonky donkey here, isn't it? Post resource, podcast all. Oh, wait, value. Is it because I'm passing through a default value? It might be. It's because I'm passing through a default value, silly Steve. So basically, you can pass through default values, I believe. No, maybe not. We missed user resource in owner relationship. Yes, I'm going to come back to the owner. So when loaded takes relationship and a value, retrieve a relationship if it has been loaded. I don't know why, if you pass value, it will still pass it through, or maybe that's because then it is loaded. We'll see. Okay, so we've got episodes. We can request them if we want them. We're probably actually Winky Wonky Donkey. Yeah, it's a great book. We're probably not going to do a user resource. I don't think the author is needed, the owner is needed at this point. So we'll probably add that later once we need it. What we will also do is on that podcast, we've got a category. There's a very kind of rubbish category, if I'm honest. So we say, okay, so category, we'll do a new category resource. And that will be a passing resource. This when loaded relationship is going to be category. So now I just need to create that one too. So let's just quickly create that one and we'll get back to it. So there's our category resource done as well. So we can now, don't need to pull that in. So now when we come back to here, perfect. So the way that I usually work with these relationships and optionally pulling them in is if you follow the JSON API specification, you would have something like you want to include the category and episodes. And when you do that, you want to eager load or side load those relationships in. So for that, I like to use a specific package because I've done it before, but it's never as good. Okay, we'll just see if we can find the package itself. So it is composer require sparsely Laravel query builder. And there we go. We found the right package name. Excellent. And if we come back to here, we just amend this basically. So here's our collection and what we are loading. Let's just do a quick. Ooh, it's being a little bit slow. So what we want to control that. So that will eventually be podcasts. So up here, we'll go podcasts equals query builder 4. Subject is the podcast model itself. And what we want is what this will give us is it will return a static query builder, but what that allows us to do is filter, sort, add includes. So it allows us to really, be very specific with how we want our content loaded. So if we go to the documentation quickly, here we go, query builder. What it allows us to do for including relationships, we can just say allow includes posts, for example. So we can now say allow includes, and we can say that the includes we want to allow is we want to allow the category, and we also want to allow episodes. And then for now, we'll just do a get request on that. Now, if we hit that, you can see we've got a category, which is currently returning null, and the episodes. So if we drop the episodes and we resend that request, we no longer require those episodes. And if we swap that to episodes, we're just loading in those episodes. And it allows you to be really kind of specific about the URL and how you want it to work. So what I'm going to do quickly in here also is we'll add in some created, and we'll do like a human, and we'll do this created at diff for humans. We'll also add a created string or created date, and we'll do this as a this created at, and we'll do this as a toDate string. So if we just come back to here, I'll drop that includes for now. And what it's going to allow us to do is pass through the created and the created date in a human format and as a date. So in JavaScript, for example, you just go podcast.attributes.created.date or .human, because we've already got the carbon. That is already a carbon instance. So it's quite quick and easy for us to do, like, let's just return that human value there compared to the front end or in a mobile application having to kind of figure out how long ago it was, and there's inconsistencies across platforms. So it's easier just to return that from the API, in my opinion. So there's our attributes. Here's our relationships. So now we can come to this category resource, and we can just fix this up quickly as well. So this category, it has an ID, which in this case is the ID. The type that it is a category. The attributes that it has is name, I believe. Oh, it's got a UUID as well. So we'll swap that for ID is UUID. Attribute will be name, and that'll be this name. Then this also has relationships, and this has podcasts, and this will be a podcast resource collection, where that resource is this when loaded, where that relationship is called. If you come to the category model, you will see podcasts. So I can pass that through, tie this off, drop in the links, which we're going to add later. So now if I do that again and just say, okay, include the category. Category is currently null. Okay. Table plus. Let's go make sure that we've definitely got a category on this one. Podcast category. Have we got categories? No. So we made that nullable. I'm just going to quickly assign that in my database over here, and that category is now 1. Save that. Don't need that anymore. So if we come back, we should now have a category. So here we go. I've assigned PHP ugly to the category PHP. Got an ID, it's got a type, it's got attributes, relationships, and links. Not as important at this stage, but if you come at it from the category angle, then this will, you can start to eager load in. If I said podcasts, you're starting to request too many, basically. or that one's not specifically allowed. I do apologize. I like this version of passing dates to the front end. Yeah, so Moment.js is actually advised against nowadays. There are some others which they do recommend, but I like to do that on the server side because I've already got an instance right there. I've got an instance of Carbon. That is not a lot of effort for me, but for someone on the front end to pull in a JavaScript library and start to process it, it's 3 to 4 lines of code here, there, and everywhere every time they need to do it. Whereas for the API, I do it once, it's done. If we need to change it slightly differently, we can quickly change that. So we could do like a format here, and we could do it a specific way. It's just a really nice, easy way to do parts of the API. So we don't need category anymore. There's our podcast resource. Here's the links. So the next step is that, to me, that endpoint, that's kind of done. There's other parts we could add to it if we really wanted to, but right now I don't think we need to. So what I would do now is typically I'd come to tests. Has test been initiated? Is it going to complain? No. Test. Perfect. So drop that for now. Drop that for now. I believe I've already got everything installed for Pest anyway. I'm not 100% on Pest yet, so I'm going to give it a go. These Pest plugin Laravel. Yeah, we have got that. So let's just create a test in here. So we'll stick this in, we'll call this like a feature test. And we will create a podcasts test.php. And we'll do something like it can receive the correct status code within the podcast one. So here we go. So let me just kind of run that one again. Okay, let's create another one. Perfect. Didn't perform any assertions, just what we wanted. So at this stage, we're just going to do a quick, I believe we can do something like this. Get. We'll get the docs up, the Laravel docs. We'll go to testing, HTTP tests, but at the same time, we'll go to pest PHP, because I don't know if there's anything we need to do specifically. Assertions. We can do those basic assertions. We might have to jump in to some of the Laravel stuff. Plugins Laravel, what is it going to allow us to do? Pest test. Available functions. Oh, you can do a get assert status. Perfect. So we can do it. We can say, okay, so get, the URI is going to be API podcasts index. And we can say assert status. We expect to see. Okay. That's our basic. Bam, passed the test. So all we're doing here, this is a very basic test. We're doing a quick GET request. If we're to do this in Laravel, it would be something like this. I think it's this GET. I haven't done it in a while. And then it will be like assert status, like that. But we're using Pest, so we may as well try and adapt to how Pest does things. Again, as usual, we will declare script types. at all times. So this is just a little helper library that I mentioned earlier. So we're just saying that, okay, this is a 200. We are going to this named route so that if it ever changes for any specific reason, let's say currently it is podcasts, but let's say we need to change that to, for some stupid reason, one day we change it to all podcasts, everything all just works. You can use Assert, okay. I could do, but I like doing declarative things. Yeah, I'm asserting that the status is this. And I'm hoping I can also assert Json fragment. And let's just say, we'll just get the first podcast here. And for this part, the fragment accepts some data, and we're expecting to see the ID being the podcast UUID, and we expect that the type is a podcast. Yeah, we're just expecting certain parts to it. Perfect. Nice and clean, nice and simple. So we're saying, okay, we expect it to be okay, and we expect to see at least this part, and then, attributes. There's other parts to the JSON testing that you can do. So the Fluent JSON testing, what you can do is assert JSON, assertable JSON, where we're missing, etc. So you can be really specific. So if we just kind of refactor to this, because I actually quite like that over a fragment. So we'll just kind of import that class. We expect that to be the podcast UUID. We expect the type to be a podcast. And can I do like empty? Empty is relationships, etc. So let's see how that works. Ooh, why is it complaining? Next page. Oh, my bad. So let's run that again. We have got a failure. What are we failing on? Property ID does not exist. Okay, so for some reason, let's just have a look at that JSON. And we will just get rid of that for now quickly. We do get it. And it is strange. That is rather strange. Can you do some light first? Nope. Assertable JSON. So we could do dot path, prop, scope. Do quite a few different things. Asserting its JSON collection. Oh, you can do like a has a certain amount. So we can do like a has one. And then we could do like a first where we have to then pass it in. So first going to get JSON in again. Let's have a look at that. Let's just grab that bit so we can just do it nicely. Format that for me, please. Podcast ID. So first, it's got one. We want one, where the ID is the podcast UUID. where the type is podcasts, and where the relationships is empty because we haven't asked for it. Again, we're failing. So we're saying call empty, something to do with empty. Empty doesn't exist. Okay, so we just do something like where relationships is an empty array ourselves. Perfect. We're now passing again. We are back in business. So what we're doing there is we're hitting a URL. We expect to see a 200 status code. Then we expect to see this JSON here. We expect to only currently get one result because we've only got the one. The first one that we get, we expect it to have an ID of the UUID of the first podcast. We expect the type to be podcast, and we expect the relationships to be empty because we've not specifically requested it. And that is, for me, a relatively good test for what we are currently doing. We can, it can receive the correct status code and payload. So we can then, do a subsequent request where we say, okay, we could do a, can we do parameters? Yeah, we can. Then we can do the parameters where we want to say include category, for example. And then that should still all match up. That should still pass. Ooh. Zero.relationships did not match the expected value. Oh, so relationships should now have, we should be able to scoping has users dot something. Perfect. So I can say relationships dot category has something. I don't want us to kind of drop too far down it. So I could do something like relationships category type, just to check this. There we go. You don't want to jump too far down because then your tests are really tightly wound, and it's not really testing your code. You're just testing what you've just written, and it just, to me, it doesn't make as much sense. Yeah, I'm mapping UID to ID because that's coming back with the JSON that is being returned. So there's our first part. So we will just add that, add it all, commit. First endpoint get all podcasts. Push that one up. And next we want to get the next route. So, okay, so we come back to our README and we've got, okay, that one's done. We'll do post in a moment, but we'll do this one now. We'll do a get. We want to do a get request. So let's come down. This one will be the create podcast. That'll be there in a minute. And then this one will be get a specific podcast. So we'll say we are doing a route get request to, we're going to use route model binding to something relatively similar to this. So we'll just drop that in for now. We will change that in a moment. And we're going to name this show. So now we can just come and create our controller. Make a controller. And we are going to call this the show controller. Ooh. There we go. So that is our controller done. So now if we come to here, change that and go have a look at it. We are going to ignore that for now. We're going to ignore that for now. And we are going to receive a podcast as an argument. So for now, we'll just return the podcast on the same. So coming back to here, this is now created. We can add a new request. We will rename this one to show a specific podcast. Collapse that back. And we are going to want to say accept application. No, that's query parameters, my bad. Accept application BND. Great. That we are just going to delete. And the URL is going to be /API version 1 podcasts. And let's just go back to here and grab the UUID that we need for that one. Send it. And we've got the one podcast already. So now we need to work with this. So we don't just want to return the podcast. We want to do something kind of similar to what we did last time, right? We want to be able to say that. So we want to say, pull in that response, eliminate response, pull in that. We don't want that to be a collection. We want that to be podcast, and we need this to be a new instance. Pull that. So there we go. Post resource takes in resource. Where possible, we will use PHP 8. So index controller collection, and that is also a resource. Nice to see that their naming is consistent. Just what I like. So what we're doing here, we are loop model binding, just getting that podcast straight away. We're saying, okay, return a new response. It's a podcast resource, and return with a status code OK, because we have it. Yeah, it will fail at that point if it doesn't exist. So we don't need to worry about that 404. Perfect. So we've literally, because we've already got that resource, we only need to return the one. We haven't got links or relationships all set up yet, but we've got the exact same thing. That is all hooked up, and that was a very quick add. But what we can also do is we can override. We can say podcast equals query builder for the subject is going to be podcast, and we want to say allowed includes are going to be an array. So we want to say, okay, we'll allow you to use category and also the at this stage probably the owner, but also the episodes. That's all we want to allow you. So let's see what that does. Ooh. Does not exist on the Eloquent Builder instance, so we'll just do like a first. There we go. Let me go back to their documentation. I believe I was on this page when I looked at it. Yep. So user class defaults for user, default includes, disallowed includes, nesting relationships, custom includes. You can create your own custom includes, which is kind of cool. Selecting include fields, casting. So what else can we do? installation and setup, we've done all of that. All of that's basic stuff. Pending attributes, advanced usage, pagination. I believe, if I just go to GitHub, I believe they've got an example on there. So they've got user class, user for query. You can chain that on. You can do lots of chaining. That's all cool. No, what you're going to have to do at this stage is not use the root model binding, basically. So unless you want to kind of double query, which you probably don't want to do because you're querying at this stage, then you're querying down there. It just doesn't make any sense to me. So instead of podcast, I will just call that like UUID. And then in the show controller, we can drop that and we can say that is a string, UUID, and we can go subject is podcast class, and that includes where the column UUID equals a value UUID. Get the first or fail. So now when we come back and when we actually make sure we spell that correctly, podcast UUID in the root. That still does root model binding though, and I'm trying to avoid the root model binding at the moment because the query builder, you want to build up the query with options. Nice, easier way to do it. So I'll pass through the string as a UUID. I was going to add that response coming back because I like return types too. No query results for model this. So where the column UUID is that. So let's just go back to the podcast. We've got has UUID. We could do a static UUID, but we don't want to do that. Is it complaining? What could it possibly be complaining about? Is it that? Is it that causing an issue? Yes. For some reason, adding those named parameters can throw things off a little bit. So we will just omit them where they cause issues. Perfect. So we got that response. So we should now be able to say include episodes. And I've got the episodes, got the full description, got lots of information, got everything I could possibly want about this. Yeah, obviously the episode hasn't been created properly as a resource yet, but we could also say, owner. Let's also get the owner. Episodes. Oh, okay, we'll drop the episodes because there's a lot of them. Relationships, we don't have owner available yet on our resource. So that means we can come back to that resource here. And then here we can say owner is a new owner resource. User resource. We'll do a user resource. Let's make it actually normal. And we'll say this when loaded, the relationship is owner. So now we just need to create that resource, make a resource, and we are going to make a user resource for now. There we go. So now we can just uncomment that. And that should now be there. There we go. Owner, person. Great. That isn't what we wanted to do. Don't save. So raw preview. Cool. That works very nicely. That is another endpoint done. There's that index controller. That's all done. I'll show controller. Sort those imports. That's all done. Endpoint completed. So now let's look at creating one. So this will be a root post request to /. We are going to hit an endpoint. We are going to give it the name store. What is a query builder package doing? It has something to do with a query string. Yeah, so let me come back to here. So this is an easier way of doing something like a podcast equals podcast, starting a query, saying if request has so we'd have to pull in the request. Make sure we've got that pulled in, import that, HTTP request. If the request has include, then we would have to then go, okay, so podcast with, and then because we're getting it through as a comma separated values, we would then have to explode from that the request get include, and then say podcast first or fail. I mean, it looks like a lot less code right there. I won't lie, it does look like a lot less code. But when you start adding in filters and sorting, this query starts to get very big and very complicated and hard to manage. So if I just quickly grab that and just do a dime dump. Preview. This will give us everything we were expecting. Here's all the attributes and relationships. Here's all the relationships we were expecting for that owner. So you can see the owner relationship, it's a user and it is the right person. So you could do it that way and there's nothing wrong with it doing it that way. But as your queries get more complicated, it becomes a lot harder to manage requests like that. It's less about the package making it easier to get something done, but more about the effort and time the package is saving you in that development and the consistency of it, because then, you know, you got to remember how you built it and this, and then you got to pull it across, and it's just encapsulating that logic for you. So back to the post. Creating a resource. So let's create another controller. And we're going to call this one store controller. As you can see, naming convention follows. Store controller, store, show controller, show. Everything's following a standard. It might not be any defined standard that's written somewhere that, you know, everybody follows. It's just a personal standard that I put in my applications so that I know where things are, how to name things, and how I can get stuff. Perfect example, I will segue quickly, is I can come over to the resources, the podcast resource, and then if I come down to links, I can add a link to self, and I can say root app, API podcasts, show, and I can pass through this UUID. So now when I come back to here, send that, go to pretty. If I come down, have a look at the links. If I click on that, send it, I'm getting the right one. Same with list. Come down, click on that. Click on that. Come on. No, it's not letting me click on it for some reason. But what it does, it allows, when you're working with it, you can get the link for that specific resource and you can just quickly follow it through programmatically. Yeah, it's very readable. It's very readable. So back from my segue, we have now got a store controller, which is here. So let me just close this down. We're going to want the request. And what we are going to want to do is return a new response where the content is something and the status is HTTP accepted. So we've accepted the request at this point. So for now, let's just have a look. Let's just create this new request within here. Let's rename this to create a new podcast. This is going to be a post request. We are going to the URL, API version 1 podcasts. Perfect. 202 accepted. We are accepting application BND, but our content type that we want to send over is JSON. Perfect. So now we can go to that body and we can say we want to send raw JSON and we want it to go through how we're going to create it. So first step is to come over and figure out what the minimum requirement for creating a podcast is going to be. So at minimum, we need a title. So come over here, title, test podcast. Actually, let's go, what's another good podcast? Someone give me a podcast name that isn't PHP Ugly, because I've already got them. I've already got PHP Ugly. Don't give me that one. Then we could do something like a language is going to be ENGB. The external URL will be some URL. Then the feed URL is going to be something else. Image is nullable, foreign user ID. So that is where we need to be authenticated, basically. No plans to merge. Good choice. Let's go find it. No plans to merge from Simplecast. So I can grab that, come back over to here. Let's just collapse that back so we've got a better view again. Can I tell that to go away too? Yeah, I can. So I can say, okay, so I want to add no plans to merge podcast. I believe I can override that when I pull in the feed. I think that's what happened with the event sourcing side of things. So now if I just copy the link for the feed, I've got that link to the feed. Let's save that and let's just send it. Great, 202 accepted. So let's step through. This is a minimum that you can send at the moment. This will probably change. I don't think those two are going to be required in the long term. So what I am going to do is I'm going to update this to be nullable update this to be nullable. And we'll just do a PHP artisan migrate fresh seed. That is doing the feed seeder. And if we go look at the feed seeder, that is where all of our magic is going on. So we are creating a UID, getting the aggregate root, and we're doing a request factory. We're just saying, right, give me that. So now if we come back to here, list all podcasts, we have still got PHP ugly, but now we just need to make sure that our UUID for show reflects the updated one, which is fine. It now does. So back to no plans to merge. We want to send that. We don't actually need that anymore, which is great. We can just send over what our title and what our feed URL is. Eventually, we could even just pass through the URL because we're doing a lot of grokking and grepping when we're actually pulling everything through from the feed. So the next step is we've got a controller. We know we can hit it. We know we can send the right response. Let's make a request and podcasts create. We call it, sorry, store request. We're following a standard. So we're creating a store request here. So now we can update this to be a store request, which means we don't need that one anymore. Import that. That one, store request. So now when we click through to it, we can say, yeah, we're already authorized, and we want the title to be required. Got to be a string, and we don't want it to be any bigger than 250, for example. Then we've got we want to expect the feed URL. That is definitely required. That needs to be a URL, and that's about it, because the URL will do most of that for us. So now when we come back, send it, great. Grab that, send it, perfect. We're failing, just as we expected. Send that again. Accepted. We've passed validation at this point. Because we're going to control how people are interacting with this. I wouldn't, usually I would start adding things like, generator that is nullable, but because I'm controlling how this is being interacted with, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to keep this very simple at this stage. So there's a validation. The next step is, we want to create this so that we can say, yeah, okay, so we've accepted it. Now let's go ahead and do it. So we had a sneak peek of that in the feed, how we want this to work. And that is going to be using that aggregate root. So if we go to our database seeders feed seeder, we're saying, okay, podcast factory build. There's a user ID. So what we need is basically that store. Now, there's a couple of ways we could do this. We could do this inline, or we could dispatch a job to handle it. There's no right and wrong way. The idea with APIs is to return as quick as possible. You want snappy APIs. So if it's a create action, I push things to the background. I say, right, okay, cool. I'm going to create this. I've accepted it. Otherwise, I would be returning a 201. This has been created, but no, I'm accepting your request. So I'm going to dispatch a job. So for that, we will come back to our domain. Or no, we don't really need our domain at this point, or do we? Catalog, jobs, sync and process. We've got a sync and process going on. So we may as well create another one within here. And we will call this one create podcast. Bam. So within there, we'll just grab this and we'll just delete all of this magic stuff within here that we don't actually need. Construct will figure out. Drop all that. Should be unique. We would need that. We don't need that. Need that. And this is called a create podcast. There's a nice job name for us. And what we're going to pass into here is a string for the title and a string for the feed URL. That's all we need at this stage. So what we can do is do exactly what we did on the feed seeder, where we're going, okay, so give us a UUID. Okay, we could probably do that in line down here. So podcast aggregate root, retrieve UUID, good old Ramsey package, UUID 4, and we want this one to be a string. And then we want to trigger the create podcast, where the podcast is the podcast factory build, and the attributes are the request validated. We will walk through this again in a second. That is complaining about something. Build attributes. Expected 2 arguments, create podcasts, and the user ID. So user ID, we will just do, for now, we'll just manually add that in. Eventually, this would be auth ID, for example, or in this specific case, the request ID. But because we're not actually authenticating yet, that'll be fine, which means that this create podcast actually isn't needed. I was talking a load of rubbish when I said we needed one. So let's just dump a water loader now that we deleted the class. Store controller. Yeah, that's not much different to just kind of dispatching a job, I suppose, is it? But we'll dispatch a job to handle the aggregate root. We will need that class back. We will need it back. So open with VS Code. This document can't be opened because it's in the bin. Oh, okay. We'll put him back. We'll put him back. Then we go down to source, domains, catalog, jobs. Assert may be restored. You are required once again. Create podcast. We're passing through the title and we're passing through that. So what we can do, we can actually just grab that and pop that there. So we can then say, import that, Ramsey UUID, import the podcast factory, and then we can just say, okay, we haven't got the request at this point. So we can say that the title is going to be this title. And we can say that the feed URL we did name it the right way, that the feed URL is this feed URL. That will handle everything that we need. Eventually, we're going to have to pass in something like user ID, and then this will be user ID there as well. That'll do all of that. Don't need that. That'll do all the magic that we need. That'll handle storing the event, which allows us to just come back and do a very simple create podcast, dispatch, and what are we dispatching? We want to send through the request get title, request get feed URL, and do request get. For now, we'll just say user ID or #1. So basically what this does, it allows you to provide the key and a default on the request. That isn't going to exist, so we're just going to do that. And that means we can just dispatch it. So if we just come back to here, and let's pull over our database. Come on, here you come. Oh, later. I do need to buy that license. I keep forgetting. So we've got 1. Stored events, we have got 2. So now if we come back to here, internal server error, undefined key generator. So this is where our podcast factory is broken. So now we can come back and teething issues when you start doing stuff. So title, that or null, description or null, copyright or null, language or null, or null. So that seems like a waste. We're just going to do that. Come over to podcast, and we're just going to say, okay, all it needs is that. So that means that when we're on the feed seeder, we don't actually need any of that. So now we can just migrate fresh, seed again. Ooh, and now we get complaints. So projector. So that is expecting that. It's not going to have any of this. External URL, language, copyright, description, all of that is coming from the feed. I don't need that. We don't need that right now. That is just kind of more than what we need. So that is now ran. Change that, close all of this down. Come over to here. We've got some events. Our podcast is still there. External URL hasn't been pulled yet. Category, all of that's been added. So now if we say, give me a new one, sending request, accepted. We have got another podcast. And we've got another event. No plans to merge. Apparently, it's also pulled through a second one, and I don't really know why. Oh, it's getting the episode straight away. So that means that if I come over to Mail Trap and just come over to my inbox, PHP Ugly is now syncing. And no plans to merge is now syncing. So now if we come back to list all podcasts, we've got more than one podcast. which means we can start to explore more options when we're coming to listing. So if we come back to this side and we come over to our controller for listing, we can do allowed filters. I believe it's allowed filters. We'll go to Sparsy Laravel Query Builder. Query Builder, filtering, allowed filters. That is exactly what I did. A cloud includes. I don't know whether you've got to do it in a specific order, so we'll test. Allowed filters, and then it's got filters, which is mixed. So I'm assuming at this stage we can do, we want to be able to filter by name. We also want to be able to filter by, if we go back to what a podcast looks like, title and language is probably a pretty good one to filter by. Because, you know, why listen to a podcast that isn't in your language, basically? So include category and filter language equals EN. So currently, both of them, if I include that in the resource, if I include the language, we will see this change. So currently we've got EN on PHP Ugly and no plans to merge is also EN. If we come back over and come over to their language, we can be very explicit. So we will say that these are EN-US. For example, doing partial is doing a like match. Okay, that's fine. So you can do filtering on a like match, which works, or you want anything that is English spoken, English specifically, or we haven't got any that speak specifically British. So we could also filter by the title, and we can say, okay, I want anything that is ugly. PHP Ugly is ugly. We'll use them. So you can add these includes, you can add these filters, and then you can add sorts. So let's go back to sorting as well. So we can do allow sorts, exact filters. Yeah, I'm allowed filters, disallowed, exact filters. Yeah, you can be very explicit. So maybe with a language, I would probably do something like where is it? Filters, filters, filters. On language, I would do something like allowed exact. Import that, and that exact is going to be that name. So when we come back to, tell you what, this, don't need it. Here, title ugly, and filter language to be EN. Perfect, but if we look for EN US, we shouldn't get any results. We drop the title filter. We get no plans to merge. If we're going to want specific EN, it's PHP Ugly. So there we go. Exact filters work. That is a good shout. Thank you very much, Joe. That's very useful. So back to sorting, we can also sort. So allowed sort on a specific thing, and it has a default. So allowed sorts. Let me guess, that one's also going to say, no, that's got to be before the filters. Allowed to sort, it's got to be in a certain order. You've got to sort it, filter, then include from the sounds of it. Sorts. So what we want to be able to sort is, mixed. We want to be able to sort by the created at, I'm assuming. Yeah. When was it last created? Probably a really bad one to add sorts onto, to be honest, when it's a podcast. You're probably going to want to sort podcast episodes more than anything. So we'll look at that later. So there's that. We've done creating podcasts. It's all triggered the event sourcing aspect through using it. We're returning nice and quickly on our creation, which is store here, create podcast dispatch. That won't give us anything back, I don't believe, pending dispatch. So this will be a null and no content really. So, but we have accepted. So you could do like a no content, but we've accepted the request. So what I typically do there is just something like create a message of, we are creating your podcast. Something like that, something nice and simple. Bam. Sending request, jobs dispatching, we are creating your podcast for a accepted. And then if we come back, we should have now just those podcasts, and another podcast. We're not doing any validation on unique at the moment. I think maybe we should on the feed URL. That would definitely save some hassle. So when we come down to the request, store request, the feed URL should be unique podcasts feed URL. So if we try and send that again, like the create request again, already been taken. So what we can now do is, I believe there's a public function messages, yep, which returns an array. And we can say feed URL dot unique. This podcast has already been registered. Perfect. And we've got it. We've got everything all hooked up. So we're validating, we're dispatching a job, we've got custom resources going on. When we dispatch this job, then we are using our aggregate route. Oh, we should probably put our lasagna in now. It's 9:30. Yeah, it's getting late, isn't it? I haven't eaten dinner yet. Oh my God. No wonder I was hungry. Right. So I think I will do one more route. One more. No, don't, you're not intruding, wifey. You are feeding me. There she is, the wonderful wife. Did you message me? Oh, okay. I was going to say, you've got my phone on charge next to you. So now we're going to do a update a podcast just in case anything changes for any reason. It's most likely not going to happen because because everything's being pulled from the feed when it's coming to updating it and how it's working. I don't think we need to worry about that too much. So what we'll do instead of updating, we'll just do delete a podcast. README. Look at us flexing on the singles. I am happily married now for gone 4 years now. Gone 4 years. So we'll do a delete request. Pass through that UUID. And we will have a controller which we route this to, and then their name will be just delete. So we'll have API podcast delete as a name. Let's create that controller. PHP artisan make controller API v1 podcasts delete controller, which is invocable. So delete controller. Now we can come through to it. We are going to return a new response. So the content is nothing currently, and the status. Sorry, I just realized I hadn't eaten, so suddenly I got all hungry. We are accepting that request also. Now, we don't actually have to return that response. We'll get to that part in a moment. This request I can drop. I can do string UUID. Drop that. Sort. So now we've got that delete request. Let's go over and just test it out in Postman. Let's create a new request. This is going to be delete a podcast. This is a delete request to, let's delete this second one here. So URL API v1 podcasts 202 accepted, but what we'll do is we will accept application VND. So that's currently just saying, yeah, cool, here you go, let's have it back. It's not doing anything yet. So a delete controller. This is where we start to look at more than what this is. So we just go, first off, we'll get the podcast. First things first, let's get the podcast. I don't want that. I want it to be the where EUID is EUID. Takes an hour. Oh, wow. That's a late dinner. True.
Frank, I'm trying not to interrupt it, so you reading my note out. Don't think writing the note.
My wife's passing me notes while on stream. I feel like I'm back at school or something.
I suppose you remember that.
I just about remember school. I'm not that old.
I'll be back in like 15 minutes.
Okay, darling. Thank you. Right. So we're either going to grab the first podcast or fail at this point as a 404. What we're going to do, I just wanted to check something because something bugs me every time I do this. If I just come to production and I send that request, that's fine. Drop that one off. I don't like how that works. I don't like that. I'm going to have a look at how I can fix that later. So for now, we'll probably do it another stream. I'll probably do a package for it, or we'll do something for it. So we got the podcast, and now we need to. How do we want to delete a podcast? You know, realistically, what we want to be doing here is creating a new aggregate route here, podcasts, sync podcast, create podcasts, public function, remove podcast, and we are going to receive a probably a whole podcast in. We'll probably just use that instead. Yep, we've got the model podcast, and we're going to return ourselves, and then we are going to say this, record that. The domain event is going to be a new podcast was deleted, and we're going to pass through that podcast as well, and then we will persist it. So all we're doing here is say, okay, so my headphones have beeped at me, so I guess I'm going to be running out of battery within the next 10 minutes. I'll quickly rush through this. So we want to remove the podcast, and we're going to create a new event now. So let's come over to our events, and we'll create a podcast was deleted event, which is going to be very similar to this. So we can just drop that in here. Podcast was deleted, extends should be stored. We're getting a podcast, different sort of podcast in, which is going to be the model. And we will just store that as podcast. We're not getting any sort of int or user or anything coming in. There's that event that is hooked up. Don't need that anymore. So now we can import that class. That all lines up, that all works as expected. Then in the delete controller, what we can do is UUID, we don't need that UUID, podcast aggregate route, retrieve a UUID, UUID4, pass that to a string, and podcast, remove podcast, and the podcast we're passing through is the podcast that we just queried. Although in theory, no, can't do it that way. There we go, and that's it. That will record that event. Nice and clean, nice and easy. We're using an aggregate route. We're returning really quickly. That will handle dispatching a job to actually delete it itself. So now we need to come down to the catalog, and we need a projector, and we need to do a public function on podcast removed, I believe, the event name. So on podcast was deleted. We receive that event in. We don't return anything back. So we're going to have the podcast was deleted event. And we're going to have the aggregate UUID also passed in. We won't need it, but it is passed in. So now we can just say event podcast delete. So we can drop that UUID because we don't actually need it. So that'll handle the deleting. And what we could also do at the same time is create a reactor, podcast reactor, and we can do public function on podcast was removed, podcast was removed, event, import that class. Ooh. Podcast was deleted. Did we call it podcast was deleted? Yeah, we did. Strange. I'm going to have to tidy up the naming later on. On podcast was deleted event. Don't really need to return anything, but what we can do is make sure that's imported. We can do a notification at this point. So get the event podcast owner notify. So when we're doing notify, I think we should be able to just quickly come down to here, notifiable database. No, it's notifications, notify instance. So we can pass through instance to that. We should be able to do like a var something here. Should be able to say var user at that point. So we can say owner equals podcast owner. And then we can say owner notify, which will give us that instance back because it's using IntelliJ and all that cool stuff. For now, we'll just do that. And we will create a new notification. Podcast was deleted. Notification.php. We'll grab something very similar to this, drop it in there. Podcast was deleted notification. We're going to pass through the podcast via notifiable mail. Caster has been deleted. And then we can say something like something simple like your podcast has been requested to be removed or something. We have to double quote this. Your podcast, this podcast title has been requested to be removed. If this was not you, please contact support, but also change your password. Thank you for using our application. Something nice and simple like that. So we'll do a new podcast was deleted notification, where the podcast is the event podcast. Done. React to the event. Hopefully now they should all just line up. Perfect. So come back to here, go to mail trap, come to our database. We should now see a deleted app. Yep. Stored events. Podcast was deleted. And we should have received an email informing us it's been deleted. All easy, all stored, and what we can do is, you can roll these things back. You're just keeping a track of all of these things, nice and easy, nice and straightforward. Nothing too tricky. Can we export this? Cool. Let's export this. We're going to stick that in code sites caster. we'll save it there. Export that. So now within here, we can just do a edit all, do a commit for episode 4, API building and using event sourcing to trigger reactors to keep, just keep it like that, done. Git push. Excellente. So what we've gone through is quite a lot, I won't lie. It is a lot of stuff, especially for the time of night it currently is. So we've done those. Don't need that. Not needed. We're not updating. We're just deleting and doing stuff along the road. Thanks. You like it. Sorry, I can't even talk. Glad you like it. So we've done a get podcasts, done a getting podcasts, creating a podcast, viewing a podcast, and deleting a podcast. And on that one and that one, we've got options where we are kind of filtering and sorting and including relationships, so we can build up our query in a very, very nice, restful way. Everything to do with creating or deleting anything that's performing an action. Yeah, it didn't die. My God, my earphones didn't die. I'm gonna get a new headset that's hardwired, I think. But anything to do with creating or deleting, anything that's kind of performing a command. So if we talk about CQRS for a second, you've got the command query, command query something. Brain's not working now. So the command aspect is where you're mutating your state, you're doing an action, you're storing something in the database, and a query is more of a lookup action. I don't know what headphones just yet. I'll have to see what my budget is before I can answer that one, to be honest. But yeah, we're following this kind of, there we go, responsibility segregation. Thank you very much, Joe. Glad one of us is still awake. So the command aspect is all about performing actions and doing something. You know, you're performing an action, you're doing something, and something should be saved. That is where you'd have like a write database and a read database. You go through that write model to the write database to handle that. Then from the query side, you would then use that read model or that read database to quickly get that data and retrieve it. It's all about those slow writes but fast reads in CQRS. And it's kind of similar to what we've done here. You know, we're doing a slow write because we're dispatching to a background process, but we're doing very quick reads because we're just doing it all in line. And that's what we've handled today. Just basic, you know, we've done like a very small test to show how we can test. Eventually, I'll start adding more tests into this, and we can start testing the event sourcing. But we'll get round to that because that's going to be quite a lengthy stream. Yeah, and I am going to call it a day before my earbuds decide to die on me. So thank you for listening, and I will see you soon.